Good morning. Continuing with our analysis of the poem London by William Blake, let us look at the form, meter, and rhyme scheme of the poem London. Form. As with many of Blake's poems, London has a simple form that furthers a discussion of complicated ideas. There are 4 quatrain stanzas. Taking a zoomed out look at these stanzas, the first can be said to deal with the sights of London, while the following 3 focus instead on the sounds of the city. Of these, the only one with a particularly inventive form is stanza 3. Here Blake takes the final word of stanza 2 and uses it to create an acrostic. The first letter of each line in stanza 3 spells out here, which helps the poem emphasize the sense of sound that the speaker experiences in London. But this formal feature is not immediately noticeable, which reflects the poem's idea that to truly understand the pain and impoverishment of London and cities like it takes a deliberate effort. Meter. On first glance, London is written in iambic tetrameter. Indeed, the first 3 lines conform to this scheme perfectly. I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet. The poem here is setting up its basic premise, a walk through London, and the regularity of the meter calls to mind the speaker's solid and rhythmic walking pace. But suddenly, this regularity is shown off in line 4, when the marks in people's faces appear in front of the speaker. Their weakness and woe disrupt the speaker's walking rhythm, and this change is reflected metrically the shortened first foot of the line, technically something called headless catalexes. We could also scan this in being a line made up of trochees, and the sound would be the same. Marks of weakness, marks of woe, for example. My dear students, if you come across any difficult word which you fail to understand, please look up the meanings and learn them. This makes the appearance of the people's faces more dramatic, as though they have literally just jumped unexpectedly in front of the speaker's eyes. What is more, line 4 isn't the only one to cut out the final syllable. Every line in stanza 3 breaks with iambic tetrameter in the same way, which makes the chimney sweeper's cry and the hapless soldier's sigh more prominent and audible, meaning you can hear it, stressed from the first 3 syllables. The lines feel louder. Lines 14 and 15 employ a form of catalexis too, with an effect similar to that of stanza 3. All of these lines scan the same way that line 4, which has been quoted above, does. The rhyme scheme. First, let us understand the definition of the rhyme scheme. A rhyme scheme is the pattern of, meaning sound, that comes at the end of each verse or line in poetry. In other words, it is the structure of end words of a verse or line that a poet needs to create when writing a poem. Many poems are written in free verse style. Some other poems follow non rhyming structures, paying attention only to the number of syllables. The Japanese genre of haiku is a case in point. Thus, it shows that the poets write poems in a specific type of rhyme scheme or rhyming pattern. London follows a simple rhyme scheme throughout, and that is A B A B. That is, each alternate line ends with the same sound. All of the rhymes are full, perfect rhymes as well. Generally speaking, the steady, unchanging rhyme as well. The steady, unchanging rhyme scheme helps the poem feel like a walk. Just like a pair of feet, one rhyme is laid down after another. It is also notable how many of these end words have negative connotations, meanings. Out of 16 ending words, perhaps only 5 sound neutral when taken out of context. And these are street, flow, meet, man, and here. All the rest deal with pain, the sounds of pain, or images of restriction. And in the final word of the poem, that is hearse, death itself. Hearse, as I said earlier, is the vehicle which carries a dead body in the coffin from the house to the church and then from the church to the graveyard. This helps the poem create an overall atmosphere of misery and brings those other 5 words into this world of negative connotations. In context, street becomes the site of London's misery, and every person that the speaker meets is evidence of oppression and pain. The poem thus uses a relatively straightforward rhyme scheme to keep the focus on its thematic concerns, namely the oppression and misery of urban life. The London speaker, the speaker of the poem. The poem is written from a first person perspective, but this I is non specific. Of course, the speaker has a lot in common with William Blake himself. In particular, they share a dislike and distrust of modern industrial London, observing the way that London oppresses and depresses its inhabitants. The speaker is, like Blake, a kind of visionary. He or she deliberately delves into the heart of London, means puts his hand in or digs deep into the heart of London, seeking to understand the city and its people. The speaker is a visionary, not just in a visual sense, but in an auditory one too. Auditory means ability to hear, the hearing sense. It is as though the speaker can see and hear all of London's pain and impoverishment at once. The speaker also has a theory as to the source of London's misery. The mind forged manacles. For the speaker, London represents a collective failure of the human mind. A better society based on love, freedom, and joy is, or perhaps only was possible, but has been replaced by the miserable beast that is modern day London. The setting of the poem. As the title of the poem suggests, the setting here is London. Specifically, it is the London of Blake's time, so the late 18th century. As the poem makes clear, this was a time of economic and social hardship. Rapid industrialization had completely changed the character of the city, and it was a hard place to survive. Hard can here be understood as a difficult place to live in. The poem emphasizes this effort for survival. The young, represented by the chimney sweepers, men, the soldiers, and women, the youthful prostitutes, all have to put their bodies on their line just in order to exist from day to day. Put their bodies on their line means to sell their bodies, in other words, to work hard till they fall dead. This creates the sense that London is an unforgiving and foreboding place where threat and danger lurk at every corner. But the poem is also set in the speaker's own particular perceptions of London. The reader is seeing, hearing, and understanding the city through the speaker's own eyes, ears, and mind. The mind forged manacles and the marriage hearse, for example, are the speaker's own ideas. Indeed, the links between poverty and authority represent the speaker's own theory that, in the speaker's mind, explains London's misery. The literary and historical context of London, of the poem. The literary context. London was published as part of the experience section of William Blake's best known works, Songs of Innocence and Experience, that was first published in 1794, though Innocence was published individually a few years prior. Prior means before. This book of poems is essentially a didactic work of moralizing through poetry. Didactic means teaching. Though Blake resists oversimplifying difficult situations, Innocence and Experience relate closely to the biblical ideas of the Garden of Eden and the fall. This is the story of Adam and Eve, if you remember, that I had told you when we were in class in first year. And Blake's work is generally full of such opposites: childhood versus adulthood, life versus death, freedom versus imprisonment. This particular poem exemplifies that trend through its focus on the oppressive nature of modern urban society. In its particular focus on economic hardship, London also closely relates to the chimney sweeper poems and The Little Vagabond from the same collection. A key poetic influence on Blake was John Milton, whose Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained also creatively examined humankind's relationship to God. But Blake was also a wide reader of religious scholarship, which undoubtedly played a formative role in his poetry. For example, the influence of Emanuel Swedenborg, a Swedish Lutheran theologian, can be seen in the way Blake consistently depicts the fundamental spirituality of humanity. Blake was not well known as a poet in his time, and many of his contemporaries considered him to be a madman. He worked primarily as a painter, printmaker, and engraver, and he felt that his poetry was misunderstood in his era. He did not enjoy the success of some of the other poets associated with the same time period, such as William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. This sense of isolation gives Blake's poetry a radical and prophetic quality. His poems often seem like small acts of rebellion against the status quo of the day. Indeed, the speaker in London has the air of a solo visionary. Solo means single, all alone. We understand the word solitude about them as they wander through the city, diagnosing its ills, meaning what the city is suffering from. Also important to his work is the idea of the visionary. There are many accounts of Blake witnessing angels or other spiritual ephemera, and this plays into the prophetic quality of his writing. He is often grouped together with the Romantic poets, and his work does share certain common ground with the Romantic ideals that dominated the late 17th and early 18th centuries. These ideals include the importance of childhood, the imagination, and the power of nature. However, his life and writings are distinct enough that it may make more sense to regard him as a singular entity in English literature rather than as a solely romantic poet. The historical context. Blake was writing during the accelerating Industrial Revolution, and he saw its economic, social, and environmental changes as a threat to humankind. For Blake, the factories of the Industrial Revolution represented a form of physical and mental enslavement. The mind forged manacles, but it would be a mistake to map Blake's complaints too closely onto the ugly world of industry. It's important to remember that Blake believed England was only a holy Christian land. He believed that Jesus had visited England, and indeed that a new Jerusalem would one day be built on its green and pleasant land. So Blake saw in modern society a collective failure of the imagination that prohibited England from fulfilling its holy potential and prevented its people from living free, happy, spiritually nourished lives. Blake was a deeply religious man, but he was highly critical of the Church of England and of organized religion more generally. He was born to a family of dissenters, a group of English Protestants who broke away from and rebelled against the Church of England. Questioning the religious status quo was therefore instilled in Blake from a very young age. He saw top down religious structures as restrictions on individual liberties and as obstacles to the direct relationship between humankind and God. The church is implicated here, shamed by the misery that the chimney sweepers have to endure when the church ought to be protecting them. Blake's rebellious streak owed something to the American and French revolutions, which gave thinkers opportunities to dream of better forms of society. With this, we come to an end of the poem London by William Blake. Thank you.